Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., for an hour and a half.
If anybody here is not familiar with jamesbowman.net, I recommend, actually I order everybody to go to that website. Jim Bowman's reviews of movies and his articles on cultural and political topics, but I want to particularly say about his movie reviews, treats the genre with a level of aesthetic seriousness and moral seriousness that most people don't think the genre deserves. He is known for being highly critical. He can't understand why somebody would read a movie review just to get another rave about a movie that's fun to watch. He reveals levels of depth and interest in every movie he writes about, far beyond any other work of media criticism that's being done in the United States. And his oeuvre over the past 16 years on that subject is really an immense accomplishment. In the midst of all of this frequent writing, he has, over the past 5 years, been working on a big book, his first book. It has just been published by Encounter Books. There are copies available for sale in the anteroom. The title is Honor, a History. I urged him to title it Honor, what it was, where it went, and how we could get some of it back. I believe it is the first book that has ever been written on the subject of honor. There are bits and pieces in other books, both ancient and contemporary. There are works of anthropology about aspects of honor. But as an organizing idea, as a concept, as a mode of behavior, there has never been anything like this immensely original and, I must say, extremely enjoyable and edifying book. The idea of honor, as explained by Bowman, is ancient. It is in many respects primitive, but it is very much a human idea and has been an immensely important part of the saga of human history up until very, very recently. I think he would date it at World War I. It was, like all human institutions, highly imperfect. It performed many functions whose desuetude is in evidence, as he illustrates, in many aspects of our culture in the West and in many important areas of international relations among cultures and nations, including especially the current conflict between the West and the terrorist elements of radical Islam. I'm delighted that he would come here tonight to talk about his book, and I want to move aside and give him the podium right away. After he speaks, John O'Sullivan, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, former editor-in-chief of National Review and currently one of its editors-at-large, will provide commentary. Jim Bowman, resident fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, movie reviewer, cultural and political critic, and author of the new book, Honor, a History. Jim?
Thank you, Chris. As always, you're much too kind. I saw a funny television commercial the other day. There were no words, but only a musical soundtrack and pictures of a fat guy of about my own age as he realizes that he's grown too big, and so begins a new regimen of exercise and eating right, both of which things he's supposed to be comically unfamiliar with. But as he sticks with it and gradually becomes more svelte over the course of a minute, we listen to the gravelly-voiced Bob Dylan on a 1960s vintage recording as he sings, "The times they are a-changin'." And then the ad cuts away, and up on the screen pops the name of the sponsor, Kaiser Permanente, along with the written exhortation, "Be your own cause." be your own cause, is about as good a summary as you could hope for of the ethos of the generation to which I belong, the post-war baby boomers. Indeed, it could be argued that, for all our self-congratulatory idealism, be your own cause was our watchword back in the 60s, too, an era which so many of us continue to regard with misty-eyed nostalgia. When hundreds of thousands of us descended on Washington to say, "Hell no, we won't go," what else were we doing but proclaiming that we, not our country or indeed anything else outside ourselves, were our own cause? When we gathered at Woodstock for 3 days of peace and love, our high ideals in action consisted of grooving to the music, getting high, and getting laid. It sure beat getting shot at in the jungles of Vietnam for some cause we'd found it easy to reject in favor of ourselves. But those of us who remember those days are likely still to think of ourselves as rebels and idealists because, by making ourselves our own cause, we actually did topple a repressive system and effect a liberation whose consequences we continue to feel today. True, the repressive system, which I shall call the Western honor culture, was by that time not very repressive. In fact, it had been knocked around pretty badly for half a century before we got to it, and it was almost on its last legs by then anyway. All it took was a little push from us, and, at least in comparison with previous revolutions, hardly any self-sacrifice. We were our own cause, remember? And the whole thing just collapsed. Nowadays, hardly anyone even knows what honor means or what it once meant. Let me pause then to explain what I think it means in a few words. It's the good opinion of people who matter to us. The people who matter to us are what I call the honor group. You will have noticed right away how honor differs from morality. The principles of morality are universally true in all times and places, but what is honorable will depend to some extent on the composition of the honor group. Looking good in their eyes thus becomes for the individual a greater cause than himself, even than saving his own life. Hence the expression, death before dishonor. You don't hear very often anymore. The dominant honor group in European countries used to be socially and economically determined and largely confined to a hereditary aristocracy. But honor underwent a revolution in the 18th century. Suddenly the honor group expanded enormously, and America led the way. In fact, the American Revolution was more revolutionary in this way than in any other. George Washington and the Founding Fathers taught the world that all men, and not just a hereditary elite, could aspire to honor. And their lesson was echoed by the European romantics, especially Sir Walter Scott and the popular novelists who came after him. That synthesis of progressive political ideas and traditional honor reached its apogee under the Victorians with the idea of the Christian gentleman. But it is now all but gone. You may regard this as a good thing or a bad thing. Nowadays, even many conservatives are likely to regard it as a bad thing. But it is important to recognize that there are large parts of the world in which the native honor culture has remained untouched by those social forces which have brought down our own. Among these are the parts of the world where America's and the West's Islamicist enemies come from, so it is helpful in understanding them, and therefore in understanding the conflict in which we are engaged, if we try for a moment to recapture what it is like to live in an honor culture. In order to do that, however, we have first to realize that their honor culture and our own, when we had one, are very different things. You only have to think of the phenomenon of the honor killing. In large parts of the world, and not only the Islamic parts, women who are guilty of unchaste behavior, or even of behavior to which unchastity might conceivably be imputed, such as going out alone with a boyfriend or wearing revealing clothes or makeup, are commonly killed by their own fathers, husbands, or brothers for having brought dishonor on the family. That kind of thing was a rarity in the West, even back in the days when the honor culture was strong. It's one of many ways in which our honor culture, when we had one, differed from those to be found elsewhere in the world. Or take another example. We know that not only the Bush administration, but virtually every intelligence service in the world, and even Saddam Hussein's own senior military staff up until January of 2003, fervently believed in the existence of usable weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, weapons which no one has since been able to find. And why were we so firmly persuaded of this? Because Saddam wouldn't allow inspectors in and otherwise kept acting as if he had something to hide. And he did have something to hide, too. For in an honor culture concerned above all with not losing face and persuading one's enemies that one is a formidable adversary, he was much more likely to have hidden, as he did hide, the fact that he didn't have the weapons than that he did have them. It's not surprising that we didn't understand this idea of honor when you consider that we have so largely ceased to understand the one that was our own. There were several reasons why the Islamic honor culture, out of which the terrorists spring, is so different from ours, but I believe the main one to have been the influence of Christianity itself. There was no inherent conflict between Islam or others of the world's major religions and the primitive honor culture that goes back as far as we have records, and probably a lot further. So the honor culture in Islamic lands has remained primitive. Only in Christendom, to give it its old name, did the dominant religion challenge and even oppose the honor culture which existed alongside it. When Jesus told his followers to love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, he was speaking directly against the honor culture, which had always demanded, as he pointed out, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. It took centuries for it to happen, but the pressure of that contradiction eventually but radically changed the Western honor culture, producing, among other things, codes of chivalry, fair play, and gentlemanliness that seemed and still seem outlandish to the rest of the world. As a result, we found ourselves getting out of touch with ideas of honor, even before our own honor culture started to go to pieces at the time of the First World War, when honor was blamed for causing what was, up until that time, the bloodiest war the world had ever seen. And as if that weren't enough, two other immensely influential forces were at work at the same time, also partly on account of the war, that further weakened the honor culture. One was feminism, and the other was psychotherapy. Traditional honor had always distinguished between men's and women's honor, and that hadn't changed even after the democratization and updating of the old and aristocratic honor culture by progressive-minded romantics and Victorians during the previous century. In fact, there were still clinging to the updated Victorian honor culture remnants of the pre-modern view that a woman's honor, by which was meant her chastity, was the property of her husband or father rather than herself. Traditional honor could hardly have survived the notion of women's equality. Meanwhile, psychotherapy was in the process of reversing the honor culture's traditional subordination of the individual to the group. By elevating the individual to the social and moral supremacy he has since enjoyed, this likewise undermined honor's foundations. That was how the old honor culture got so banged up by the time we got to it, we who were and who remain our own cause. When it fell apart, pieces of it remained, local honor cultures that survived here and there. The biggest piece was the military honor culture, without which our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines could simply not fight. Smaller, weaker honor cultures are still found wherever people are engaged in a corporate enterprise. We all still care what our family, our friends, and our co-workers and professional colleagues think about us, and to that extent, these are all honor groups. The nation remains an honor group to the extent that patriotism still exists, but patriotism now is usually thought of rather as a feeling than as an obligation, rather as a warm glow in our hearts than a call to action. It demands nothing of us except that we obey the law. The shared honor culture that used to belong to everybody and that taught us not just to love our country, but also how to love it and why it was lovable, is largely gone. Whether honor can ever make a comeback, I am somewhat skeptical, but I want at this point to set aside questions of individual honor for another occasion, or perhaps for the question period, and talk instead about national honor. For whatever may be true of the viability of individuals without individuals without honor within a given society, it seems to me that among nations, honor remains as indispensable as ever. It is our failure to understand this which has created so many of the foreign policy disasters of the last half century and more. It's not fashionable to say this, but the Iraq War was about oil, or so wrote John Judas in the New Republic online the other day. I would be the last person to turn my nose up at the unfashionable as such, but sometimes things are unfashionable not because they are true, but because they are false. Anyway, it depends on where you stand. In some quarters on the left, to say that the war was about oil is at least as fashionable as Birkenstocks and tie-dyes. Indeed, insofar as the left has any reason for being anymore, it is to seek out and expose, whether in the streets or in the pages of the New Republic, just such hidden motives as this, beneath the moralizing rhetoric used by those in power to justify the use of military force. Kevin Phillips, too, thinks that oil is the real reason for the war, but rather confusingly, he's added a second real reason in the shape of the evangelical interest in establishing what he calls an American theocracy. Fortunately, there seems to be no limit on the number of real reasons there can be hidden beneath the unreal ones, so we can add to their number the theory of John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, set out in the London Review of Books, that the real reason is the sinister influence of the Israel lobby. Neither Mr. Judas's, nor Mr. Phillips's, nor Mrs. Mearsheimer's and Walt's arguments are quite persuasive to me, but I would like to join them in the favorite game of the anti-war party by mentioning what I think is the real reason for the war. It is a reason which, like the ones they advance, I believe to have skulked guiltily behind the publicly declared ones about weapons of mass destruction and bringing democracy to the Iraqi people. Its name is honor. To be sure, I thought that honor would have been better served by other wars than the one that was chosen, but it was kind of hard to have that debate when the word honor was never mentioned by either the pro or the anti-war side. For to admit to having gone to war for national honor, as I believe we did, as indeed we always do, would, I'm afraid, have been thought of by most people, even most Republicans, as being at least as shameful as admitting that we had gone to war for oil, for Christian millenarians, or for the undue influence of a foreign power. Why is that? One answer lies in the utopian bias that the left has imposed upon our political discourse. Ever since the war to end wars in 1914-1918, war has seemed so horrible to large numbers of people that nothing less than bringing about permanent peace or protecting them from the most imminent of dangers, such as weapons of mass destruction, could possibly justify it. The doctrine of basic honor, that when we or our friends have been hit by them or their friends, we must hit back, has hardly been heard since the outrage that greeted the German rape of Belgium in 1914. Even after Pearl Harbor, the official rationale for joining in World War II was designed to play down retaliation and revenge and to play up the idea of the death struggle between democracy and dictatorship. This even though we ourselves were allied with the world's bloodiest dictatorship at the time. Ever since then, the unprecedented crimes of Adolf Hitler have served as almost the only paradigm for an acceptable casus belli, at least if we are to judge from the frequency with which the late German dictator's name comes up in connection with talk of going to war. That's what I call setting the bar high. It also explains why those on the anti-war left get so cross. Though Stalin was at least a rival of Hitler's for the title of world's worst dictator, neither his successors in Moscow, nor Ho Chi Minh, nor Saddam Hussein, awful as all of them were in the same league. Thus, the idea that Saddam, for instance, was another Hitler who had to be stopped on his march to world domination was so unpersuasive as to suggest to the war's opponents, rightly I think, that it was merely a mask for some other and less palatable motivation, one that the pro-warriors would not have wanted to come out. Apart from anything else, the world is filled with dictators and strongmen who are as bad or worse than Saddam. Why then did we go to war against him rather than any of the others? To people like John Judas, the fact that Iraq was or was the world's second or third largest oil exporter provides all the answer they need, even though their theory hasn't got an answer to the objection that history affords us no example of an enemy, not even Saddam, who has been so dastardly as to refuse to sell us his oil. I think that honor offers a better theory. It's also why I think polls show that large numbers of Americans stubbornly persist in the belief in the connection between Saddam and al-Qaeda. To the anti-war left, this only demonstrates the success of the administration's propaganda campaign, even though it stopped making that argument long ago. But my belief is that what those polls are showing is public indifference to the question of the nature and extent of Saddam's links with Islamicist terrorism before the war. Like al-Qaeda itself, these believers in the connection between Islamicists and Baathists care much more about what has happened after the war, when that connection has become undeniable. Though forged, like America's alliance with Stalin during the Second World War, on the principle that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, it is enough for many people retroactively to justify the Bush administration in attacking Saddam as a retaliation for 9/11. This is because most people still instinctively understand the demands of honor. In its terms, striking back at someone with only a distant connection to our attackers is actually more effective in sending the message that we and our power are not to be trifled with or disrespected than hailing the criminals themselves or their close associates into court. We had a good illustration of where that leads last week with the tragicomic end to the trial of Zacarias Moussaoui. From the point of view of the honor culture he represents, it made perfect sense for him to proclaim, "America, you lost, I won." Hard as it is for us to swallow, that is almost certainly how a large part of the world that might be tempted into sympathy with America's most deadly enemies will see it too. Opponents of the death penalty for Mr. Moussaoui told us that killing him would only make him a martyr. But better to have another martyr, and if there's one thing the inventors of suicide bombing are hardly short of, it's martyrs, than to have an enemy thus proclaiming his victory over us because we haven't got the gumption to swat him like a fly. Those who deplore America's cultivation of honor and the fear and respect among our enemies that go with it will doubtless say that affording him all the due process of our criminal law, criminal justice system, and then sparing his life because he too must be considered as one of life's victims, is the best illustration of the superiority of our system to the savage and brutal honor culture of our enemies, and to them it is. But they should also be aware that to those within that savage and brutal culture, it is no such thing, but merely one more reason to despise us and confirm them in the belief that we don't have the will to defend ourselves. It was to counter that belief that in American weakness and vulnerability that we went to war in Iraq in the first place, or so my own personal conspiracy theory would claim. And if it wasn't, it should have been. But just as Saddam Hussein tried to look strong by encouraging our belief in his WMDs, but really was weak, so our formidable military presence concealed another kind of weakness, a weakness of will and determination to make ourselves respected among those for whom only violence or a credible threat of its deployment will engender respect. It seems to me that international relations among stronger and weaker nations have always been conducted in terms of this respect or its absence, and unavoidable that they will continue to be so conducted in the foreseeable future. Any responsible government has got to consider the national honor as a precious legacy that many have paid for in blood, and that has to be preserved if we are to continue to enjoy national freedom and autonomy, as well as to avoid war with those who, in its absence, will find us a soft target. If, as I suppose, the real reason for the war in Iraq, as for the war in Afghanistan, was not for oil or Jesus or the Israel lobby, but the protection of our national honor and the reassertion of our right to be respected by lesser but potentially aggressive powers who would otherwise be tempted to become our enemies, why should it have been such a shameful thing for the administration to have admitted as much? So shameful, indeed, that none of the war's apologists, none that I know of anyway, seems ever to have brought it up, even as one reason among many for America's resort to arms. What made them so afraid to cite honorable as opposed to moral or prophylactic reasons for going to war? Well, just look at what happened the last time the word honor was heard on the sweaty lips of an American president. Richard Nixon, you may remember, desperately sought peace with honor in Vietnam, by which we and our enemies both understood that he meant some desperate shift by which he could save face and avoid the appearance of a humiliating defeat, which would play havoc with our reputation and credibility as a military power all around the world. This was the condition that Nixon himself had so memorably described in connection with the Cambodian invasion as America's reduction to the state of a pitiful, helpless giant. Needless to say, it didn't work. Nixon should have remembered the scandal that had been caused by the revelation of the Pentagon Papers that the secret motivations of the architects of the war were, in their words, 70% to avoid a humiliating U.S. defeat to our reputation as guarantor, i.e. honor, and only 10% to permit the people of South Vietnam to enjoy a better, freer way of life. In the official propaganda about the war, these proportions were roughly reversed, so it was hardly surprising if people thought that they had been lied to. Likewise, when the young John Kerry testified before Senator Fulbright's Foreign Relations Committee in 1971, his most ringing indictment of the Nixon administration was that someone has to die so that President Nixon won't be, and these are his words, the first president to lose a war. To Lieutenant Kerry, as he then was, this concern seemed a merely personal vanity on Nixon's part, a virtual admission that Vietnam was the, quote, mistake which you couldn't ask a man to die for. It's not that Lieutenant Carey considered the argument from honor and rejected it. He never even began to understand it. And in this, he was typical of those in the anti-war party to whom he was appealing, and then and who have continued to protest against America's wars, including the one in Iraq today, ever since. So influential has the anti-honor party become that no president since Nixon has dared to make even the negative and oblique appeal to honor that he did in justification of the deployment of America's troops abroad, though I believe that honor has continued to be the unacknowledged motivation behind such deployments. It's a discouraging thought for believers in national honor like myself, and I'm afraid I can offer no good reasons for thinking that a greater frankness on the part of the administration about the honorable roots of its policies in Iraq and elsewhere would be greeted by anything but howls of outrage from its opponents, and probably many of its dwindling bands of supporters as well. For 30 years and more, we have been schooled in the therapeutic belief that we are, or ought to be, our own cause, so that even when there is, as I have said in connection with the al-Qaeda-Saddam link, an instinctive but mute understanding of honor's demands, we no longer have the vocabulary with which to express it. If my book does something to reintroduce that vocabulary into our national discourse, it will at least be a first step. Thank you.
John O'Sullivan, please.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the kind remarks you made about me earlier. I'm grateful to hear them. And Jim, thank you for a splendid presentation. Having read your book, I wasn't surprised by it, and I did leave some space at the beginning of my talk to disagree with you. But in fact, I don't generally disagree with you, which is why I think most of my remarks are going to be directed to your book rather than to what you've just said a moment ago. Though at the very end, I will disagree on one point, or rather, develop one point. Well, first of all, let me say about Mr. Bowman's book, although this is not a book review, it is a splendid book. It unravels the complexities of a very tangled moral cum social concept very clearly indeed. It does so extremely readably. It illustrates a powerful argument with examples drawn from high and low culture examples that are in themselves fascinating. See in particular his reflections on the film The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp when you buy the book. And it is very largely correct. Not politically correct, simply correct, which is quite different. In fact, I would say that being a reviewer of honor, I read the book from beginning to end, but if you want to treat it as a kind of chocolate box into which you can dip occasionally for pleasure, I think it works very well that way too. Now, I want to begin my reflections on his arguments in the following way. I want to do so by reference to a very topical film, United 93, which is just out now and which you've probably read about. Because it seems to me that we see in that film a clash between two very different notions of honor. First of all, there is the notion of honor which the terrorists, the Islamist radicals, have in their own mind about themselves. They have a very primitive notion of honor, which is described in Jim's book. They are, in fact, its embodiment. I should say that nobody makes speeches in this film. We have to, so to speak, infer their opinions from their actions. But those actions are extremely eloquent. Because their honor and its actions, their honor demands the punishment of any insult, condignly. Their honor consists of a mixture of piety and courage. They pray, and they have a kind of high-strung bravery which carries them through most, though not all, of the hijacking. They are entirely lacking either in mercy or compassion. They murdered 3 people in the course of the hijacking. These murders are not strictly necessary to their purpose, though they serve the purpose perhaps of intimidating everybody else. And in fact, in some respects, they complicate their business. Eventually, they complicate the project of destroying the Capitol building. But this willingness to murder at random, so to speak, stems from their contempt for those outside their own honor group, people who lack honor. That includes, of course, the passengers of the plane, but it also includes virtually everyone living in the United States. Now, do the American passengers really lack honor, as the terrorists imagine? No. They demonstrate that conclusively by fighting back, by attempting to take control of the cockpit, and by being prepared to die in the attempt. But their honor is very different indeed from the honor of the terrorists. It is different in the following ways. First of all, it is up to a point prudent, even instrumental. While the passengers think that the hijacking may result simply in their being inconvenienced unpleasantly for several days, but they eventually return to their families, even though they're obviously not enjoying the experience, they are prepared to be passive. It is when they learn of the destruction of the World Trade Center and of the Pentagon and foresee their own fate in the same way that they fight back and retrieve their honor. They prove themselves to be, by any standard of honor, Western or not, worthy of respect. But this honor is compatible with tender feelings and the expression of emotion. It is not essentially stoic. They bid loving farewell to their families and friends over the telephone. They weep. Some of the people who weep go on to demonstrate great bravery. The most tender emotions, however, in no way imply appeasement. They attack one man, a European, I thought that was slightly over-egging the pudding myself, who continues to argue for passivity, even when it is clear that the terrorists are bent upon their deaths. They overpower him and restrain him. And finally, the honor of the passengers is self-sacrificial. The most important point, it seems to me. The passengers seek to stop the terrorists. They seek to get control of the plane, even though this is likely to result in their more immediate deaths than postponement. Partly they do it because, in a sense, they can't think of a better alternative. There isn't one. And partly they feel the terrorists want to aim the plane at another iconic target, like the Pentagon or the World Trade Center, and they want to frustrate that purpose. So let's go quickly over that. They want to protect others, they want to frustrate the terrorists, and they don't go like lambs to the slaughter. In all these ways, the Americans retrieve their honor, as I say, by any standard. They also demonstrate that genuine honor is compatible with other virtues, such as prudence and mercy, and in the end, they win. That is to say, the terrorists don't achieve what they set out to achieve. And by frustrating the terrorists, not only have they reacted more swiftly than anyone could conceivably have imagined to the new world of 9/11, this happens 1 hour after the whole thing starts, they demonstrate, it seems to me, that the concept of honor held by Americans and most Western people is not only morally superior to the primitive honor code of the Islamists, but is also superior by the acid test of material success, or practical success, rather. Now, Jim's book is an explanation, is built on exploring the different concepts of honor that are here displayed, and other ones as well. He examines how the Western nations' notions of honor, which began as pretty similar to those to other primitive honor codes, gradually developed along. Originally they were concerned with the warrior's public reputation. They became something much more complicated under the influence of principally Christianity, later Romanticism, and so on. He sees I'm sorry, I can't read my own writing here. He sees the clash that is likely to develop between this concept of honor and other ones, as in United 93. And he worries that the Western code of honor is disappearing because it is increasingly overwhelmed by the other virtues, which it once it held itself in fruitful tension. You might say that primitive notions of honor correspond to what Shirley Robin Letwin called the vigorous virtues. Western honor gradually assimilated the softer virtues into itself, and these softer virtues are now undermining and overwhelming the vigorous virtues on which the concept is fundamentally rooted. Now, I have three questions to raise. The first is, what tamed knightly honor in the first place? After all, it was originally socially exclusive, the preserve of military elites. Well, it begins, it seems to me, and much of what I'm saying is going to draw on what I've learned from Jim, but I hope I'm adding value as well, as they say these days. It became a universal moral possibility, even a universal moral aspiration, as as violence itself was tamed by the modern state. Dueling lingered on for some time in some places, but by the turn of the 20th century, a gentleman did not need to carry around a sword. Now, he might need to carry around something else. As I say, dueling, the gentlemanly ideal was often thought to be socially exclusive, and it began that way. But the sociologist and wit, Christy Davis, and sociologists and wit are not often found in the same sentence, refers to describe something that a workman at the turn of the 20th century carried around with him. He called it his character. And this was a testimony that a previous employer had made, not to his occupational skills, but to his moral virtues, his diligence, his sobriety, his decency, his failure, his non-drunkenness. And this was as much an expression of the gentlemanly ideal as something in Jane Austen. A second way in which the Western notion of honor developed was it changed from a defense of one's public reputation in martial terms to the cultivation of private moral virtues. There's a lot of amusing stuff in Jim's book about Lancelot and Guinevere, how everybody knows that they're having an affair, but that everybody pretends not to know it, so that the question of whether or not they're having an affair can be settled by Lancelot defeating those rascals who allege he is. If he defeats them, he's not having an affair. If he doesn't, well, he's in trouble. Now, this concept of honor as a public defense of reputation, which can be determined by physical bravery, this was changed out of all recognition to become the possession of genuine private virtues, probity of one kind or another. But always, it seems to me, always allied with courage. Courage in men and chastity in women are, so to speak, the shorthand of honor. And thirdly, as honor lost its martial explanation, its martial character, it gained a different sort of martial character. It became a matter of pride, a matter of honor, a matter of pride to the gentleman, that he would lend his assistance to the weak, to women certainly, but to other weak people as well. When Harvey Mansfield was speaking in Washington a few weeks ago, I raised the question of whether or not people who stopped bullying were manly, which he agreed, but he also thought that the bullies might conceivably be regarded as manly too. Now, whether or not that's true, the bullies certainly are not gentlemanly, and it would and Dr. Arnold of Rugby regarded one of his aims as to stamp out bullying by cultivating the gentlemanly code in his boys, that they would step in and stop it. And as late as the 1950s, when I was at school, that was very much the theory we were taught. So, all in all, honor was demonstrated in women, by protecting women and the weak. The result of this blending of the vigorous virtues, traditional honor, with the virtues such as compassion, is what Jim calls the Victorian synthesis. Arnold of Rugby, I've mentioned, muscular Christianity, the dissemination of this set of ideals throughout the Anglo-American world. Could I just borrow the book? There's one wonderful passage in page 98 in which Maurice Samuel, I think it's, sorry, it's not 90. I've written 98, but it doesn't seem to be on 98. Oh, yes. Maurice Samuel, who was a Romanian Jewish immigrant to Manchester, read the schoolboy literature at the time and was entranced by it. It was schoolboy literature you may even have read yourself even today, not just Tom Brown's School Days, but also Tom Merry, the Billy Bunter books, and so on. And he says in them, "Among us Jewish youngsters," wrote Samuel, "honor bright was used as often as in the stories of Greyfriars. The code also included the stiff upper lip, which was as tacitly a part of a decent fellow's equipment as it was unthinkable to be a bully. It would have horrified us to be told that a bully could keep a stiff upper lip, just like Tom Merry or Harry Wharton. Bullying was among the unforgivable sins." I remember Arnold Beichmann saying that exactly the same thing about his upbringing in the United States, that he read these novels and he thought this was a superior moral code to the ones that he saw about him. You know, there's a saying that no lady can be a gentleman, but even that is open to doubt. In the novels, in her classic study of the novels of Anthony Trollope, Shirley Robin Letwin points out that on Trollope's own criteria, the best example of a gentleman in his novels is Madame Max. She was a Jew, a foreigner, a radical, and a woman. But the Duke of Omnium, the most admired and prominent man in England, proposed marriage to her, and which more or less establishes her status, and she was sufficiently confident of that gentlemanly status to refuse him, since there was an element of condescension in it. Now, as the late Victorian and Edwardian concept of Western honor, the gentleman, it spread. It spread in a way more widely than we can quite grasp today. I'm going to give you two examples of it. Two examples which are an example of the self-sacrifice, which is the severest test of gentlemanly behavior. One is the Titanic, of course. There are a number of stories like that. My favorite is Benjamin Guggenheim's remark. He told the lighthouler, the first mate, he wouldn't get in the lifeboats while the women and children were there. He said, "Mr. Lighthouler, if you survive, I would be grateful if you would tell my wife that I behaved decently." And of course, there is, to show that these virtues went right down the social scale, there is the famous case of the Birkenhead. A troop ship, but on its way to South Africa, struck a rock, was sinking fast. In order to allow the women and children to escape in the lifeboats, the Royal Marines lined up in formation on deck and stayed in formation as the ship sank. As Kipling said, "To stand and be still to the Birkenhead drill is a damn tough bullet to chew." But they did it, etc., etc. So here you had an ideal that was very, very hard to live up to, and yet it spread worldwide. I don't believe any concept of honor has had the kind of international dominant cultural authority that that one did at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. It didn't just expand. It wasn't obviously just in England. It wasn't just in the British Empire. It wasn't, of course, it was simply in the great American Republic, though it was in all of those places. But it was in those informal empires, like countries, informal imperial countries like Argentina, or even the continental countries like Italy, which looked to the English-speaking world. Now, that being the case, we have to explain why did it collapse. Because, as I say, I don't believe any other concept of honor, which are explored in Jim's book, has had that kind of appeal. Yes. See if I can see it. No, I can't read my writing there, I'm afraid. It's a pity, because I know that was a good point. Now, why did it collapse? Well, there are a number of reasons given by Jim in the book. The First World War is obviously one of the main ones. Second is feminism, and so on. I think, candidly, there are three. First, there is the advance of the regulatory state. Gentlemanly honor always was rooted, after all, in the notion of self-reliance. You can't stop bullying if you yourself are likely to be bullied. You have to be able to stand on your own 2 feet. And only and self-reliance, therefore, is something which has to be maintained if the gentlemanly honor code is to be maintained. But the regulatory state gradually reduces the need for self-reliance. After all, it's looking after you. And when it does so, it also makes self-reliance more difficult financially and in other ways, because what was originally help to other people begins to seem to be the usurpation of functions that should be properly carried out by the government. The second, I would say, is the advance of the development of the regulatory state into the therapeutic state. And with Ms. Sattel here, I don't intend to say anything more about that. She can deal with that in questions. And then finally, there is multiculturalism, which casts doubt on all standards of behavior which are not readily explicable on the basis of some criterion like need. So that the standards of behavior of a gentleman would either have to be abandoned, or they would have to be explained to everybody from first principles, and that simply is not practical. So that's why it declined. Can it then survive? Well, it has never entirely disappeared. Jim himself concedes, amid much pessimism, that he himself is increasingly attracted to it, has been, against his will almost, attracted to it. I have to say precisely the same thing. My opinions were not always what they are now, and I've gradually found myself more and more thinking that this was a wonderful ideal, which the loss of which would be terrible. It seems to me that honor is imprinted on the human heart, and that the gentlemanly concept of honor is more fully appeals to the human heart than any other. That explains its international dominance. So I suppose that honor killings might conceivably appeal to people outside the culture in which they grew, but I don't see any evidence of it, and I don't think it at all likely. There are cases of, there's no doubt that many of these ideals are cross-cultural. The case, for example, courage is always cross-cultural. We can admire examples of courage in tribes which otherwise strike us as completely unknowable. But it is possible, here's my final point, it is possible that because of the growth of regulation, the therapeutic state, and a series of other social developments, honor will simply gradually disappear, leaving behind simply a nostalgic flavor in literature. On the other hand, let me say that I find it hard to imagine this happening. Because I think it's imprinted in the human heart, I think that it is therefore something which will always be capable of being revived and re-aroused. I see some evidence of this in a number of ways at the moment. Mr. Mansfield's book, Jim's book, the behavior of people in the film United 93, which was, after all, behavior in real life, and the reaction of Americans to 9/11 across the society, which led to greater admiration for heroism, people like policemen and firemen, which intruded even to such unlikely places as sex in the city. So Jim's pessimism about a revival of honor seems to me to reflect a very sensible skepticism about the moral and intellectual elites who dominate our culture at the moment. But whether or not honor survives will really come down to the question of whether or not we have enough honor to fight for it. Thank you.
Okay. John, thank you very much. I'm going to turn immediately to questions from everybody assembled here, because I know that there will be many. There will be a floating microphone. If you'll please wait for a second until the microphone arrives, and introduce yourself. We'll start with this gentleman, whom I will introduce as David Frum. David?
Thank you both, Jim. I've had a chance to read the book, and it is indeed a marvel. It's witty, it's learned, and it's very provocative, and we're all in your debt. I want to ask you about another film than United 93, which Sean referred to, a much shorter film that was distributed by the Department of Defense last week. It was the film that showed the terrorist Zacarias misusing a rifle and one of his followers burning his hands because he doesn't know enough not to hold the barrel of the gun. Do you think this kind of tactic of ridicule and belittlement is effective in opposing a traditional honor culture, or do you think it's counterproductive and that now somebody like Zacarias has to go kill even more people to prove that he's not as big a fool as the Americans make him out to be?
I think both things can be true. I think it is effective in fact, perhaps the most effective thing that we can do to make them look ridiculous is a humiliating experience, and one which is particularly humiliating within the context of that honor culture. The point is not what it will do to Mr. Zacarias. That, I mean, presumably it will make him very cross, but what effect it will have on his relationship to his followers. And I think if he loses credibility in their eyes, it's a good thing. It can be only a good thing for us and for the world. So I'm all for it. I think it's a good idea.
Ben Wattenberg?
Thank you, Chris. Of course, we should not be surprised that Jim Bowman came up with a brilliant disquisition. We expect that. However, unlike John O'Sullivan, I really have some points of disagreement. I mean, first of all, I look at the podium there, and I see 3 men of honor. I traveled with John McCain in 2000, and he said that his best line was, "We need a cause larger than ourselves." George W. Bush, I heard him last week speak about the war, and he said and repeated, "I have not lost my nerve. That is the only way we will lose this war, is if I lose my nerve." He and Vice President Cheney have said from day one that what they have to do is prove American staying power, that the idea that we have a failed foreign policy, having achieved the status of an omnipower never seen before, I don't think is true. And let me close on a movie metaphor, if I might. In this very room, the very first large session we had was based on the popular culture, and the Academy Award-winning director Sidney Pollack said, "In American movies, the hero shapes destiny," which is an honorable concept.
Do you want me to say something to that? Yeah, I think that's right. I wouldn't be understood to be saying that Iraq is a foreign policy disaster. I hope I didn't convey that impression. I don't think it failed, and I do agree that President Bush has not lost his nerve, and he's all the more honorable for it. But the point I was making is that for all that we recognize the experiences of Vietnam and of Iraq are different, they have this in common, that the real reasons for the war could not be expressed in public, and I think that's crippled our effort there, as it will do wherever the same thing happens.
Yes, sir.
I'm Virendra Prakash from India, and I saw this a certain resurgence of reclaiming honor in India, which wasn't very good. And that was the Hindutva thing that happened in Gujarat, and that prompted me to write a book called Hindutva Demystified. Now, for here, my problem is that of what we usually have in economics, that of aggregation. I find the concept of honor group very interesting, worth pursuing. But when we start aggregating groups and make it a national level thing, then I think there come very many problems which you might have discussed in the book, but I would like to throw some light on that. My question is there an honor which applies to those who are rich, who have lots of armaments, who have got everything in life? And then there is a middle class which is trying to go up, which is also trying to prevent slipping down. And then there is the third class of people who don't probably have enough to eat, who can't defend themselves against iniquitous order of society or bullies or all that. So if we divide society in 3 levels, then do you think there will be 3 concepts of honor? Thank you.
I don't think that's the case. I'm not sure whether you're referring to America or India or some generic society. America? No, I think one of the things about America is its sort of unitary culture from the point of view not only of honor but of other things as well. I mean, there are, to be sure, differences in economic success among our people, but the culture is remarkably uniform, and I think you'd find the same attitudes to honor in the very highest and in the very lowest people in our society. That would be my impression.
My name is Philip Terzian. Both Jim and John O'Sullivan ascribe the decline of the Western honor culture, ascribed it in part to the rise of psychotherapy without fully explaining what that means, and as if everyone in the room knew why it was to blame. And I was wondering if you could just expand on that a little bit.
Sure. In fact, I'd like to. It's the one thing I did want to mention in respect to what John was saying, because I had a slightly different impression of United 93 than he did. I thought, like him, that it was a good film and very gripping and paid tribute to the people on that plane who fought back. But I had some slight reservations because it was known and it was evident in the film that the heroism of the 4 men that we know were the greatest of the heroes: Todd Beamer, Tom Burnett, Jeremy Glick, and Mark Bingham, were downplayed. And this was in response to the concerns of the families on that flight. Paul Greengrass, the director of the film, deliberately set out to have the cooperation and agreement of all the families in everything that he did in that film. And it was for that reason that none of those men were named, and that in the melee of the counterattack, as it were, they were not. The camera did not pick them out to distinguish them. It was shown as a sort of universal heave by the passengers towards the cockpit, and the reason for that was, as some of the families explicitly said, that we don't think there were 4 heroes. We think there were 40. They were all equally heroic. Now, what that comes from, I mean, and these were people who thought their relatives would have been dishonored by not being counted among the four men we knew were the leaders of the counterattack. It seems to me that comes from the doctrine of self-esteem, which is, in a way, what the therapeutic culture has substituted for honor. Honor, the one thing it cannot be is even equally distributed. It goes to those who merit it. And if it goes to everybody, then nobody merits it. Everybody gets it as of right. And that's what self-esteem is. Self-esteem is honor as of right, which is not honor at all. And it's in that way particularly that I think the therapeutic culture has undermined and almost made impossible honor as traditionally understood. I hope that answers your question.
Chris Levinek from AEI. Jim, I'd like to point out a necessary correlate of honor, shame, and acknowledge my own shame in not having read your book yet. You've given us an awful lot to think about, and I look forward to doing so. But I'd like to explore the notion of shame as applied to individuals. It seems to me it still persists. And being the flip side of honor, is that not some indication that a bit of the honor culture, diluted to be sure, transformed and narrowed, still exists? The 2 examples I'm thinking of are shame that sort of centers around, is it picking up? That still centers around city, or that still centers around a rigorous judgmentalism. I mean, these are 2 things that are widely shamed echoes of the honor culture.
There's a passage in my book that I think it's chapter 11, begins with an episode of The Sopranos, which I think is a marvelous television series illustrating. It is, in fact, the whole thing, all 5 seasons of it so far, a perfect illustration of where honor does survive and how far this is still with us. It's with us, though, in a kind of vestigial sense, as we see it. In the particular bit that I pick out, there is a beef or a potential revenge, a question of revenge coming up, when one of the mafia people says something derogatory about the weight, the size of the wife of another one, and this man appeals to the traditional sense of honor. Johnny Sack is his name. His wife is very large indeed, and she has an eating disorder. It's described in explicitly therapeutic terms, and the joke that the other man says infuriates Johnny himself, and he demands satisfaction. He actually uses that word, presumably without knowing the history of that expression in honor societies. And the other people, both his own capo, his own boss, and Mr. Soprano, who is the boss of the other guy, get together and they scratch their heads and they can't figure out. I mean, in a way, it is like the old days when a woman's honor was compromised. It involved her husband in fighting for it and fighting to the death, indeed, or taking revenge if you're a mafioso. But on this occasion, but what would compromise a woman's honor in the old days was an imputation of unchastity, the idea that she had been granting her favors to someone not her husband. In this case, the idea that someone had called her fat when she quite obviously was fat was a puzzler. But there was some considerable sentiment that, in fact, yes, this was a dispute. And Carmine, the boss of Johnny's, says, well, okay, we'll tax him. We'll charge him $200,000 for saying that his wife is too fat. I mean, these kind of vestigial remains of honor certainly continue to exist, but they exist partly because I think you're right. We can't do without. In the book, I also distinguish between what I call the reflexive honor and cultural honor. And cultural honor is the way we make sense of these things. In the old days, the cultural honor of the mafia would have known just how to proceed in that situation. Now they're as much at sea as the rest of us, because we don't have a cultural honor anymore. All we have is that reflexive honor that when we're insulted, we have to stand up for ourselves and fight back. And I think the same is true of shame, probably. We still instinctively feel shame about certain things, but we don't have any language to describe to ourselves when we should feel shame and when we should feel honor.
Mark Plattner. I thought that was a marvelous lecture, Jim, but I'm afraid I am one of those who haven't read the book as yet either.
Okay, it's for sale outside.
And I wondered, in the catalog of various destroyers of honor that have been listed, ranging from Christianity to the therapeutic ethic and Freud and so on. One common enemy, or enemy would be in some common accounts of this, is not mentioned, which would be capitalism or the bourgeois ethic, which is often seen as being counter to the warrior or aristocratic ethic. And I wonder if this is something that you discuss at all in the book, whether you view it in that way, or what your take on that would be.
I think that was often said at the time of the revolution that I talked about. That was why Napoleon called Britain a nation of shopkeepers. To him that meant they could have no honor. But what the Victorians accomplished in that synthesis that I mentioned was the really revolutionary idea that you could be bourgeois, you could be from the middle classes and still be honorable. And it was, as I say, as much Americans as anybody else in the world, probably more Americans than anybody else in the world who created that idea first. The founding fathers were among the first to democratize honor in that sense. So I don't see I don't see a problem with that, at least not for the last 200 years.
Hello, Fratkin. I also want to say that I enjoyed the lecture very much, Jim, and I really look forward to reading the book. I wanted to ask a question that relates to the comparison you've drawn, I gather in the book, but also in the lecture, between the honor culture of contemporary radical Muslims, and which, as you know, I'm particularly preoccupied with, and the spectrum of such cultures. You pick in particular the phrase "death before dishonor," and that surely is a minimum condition of any notion of honor. There's a willingness to die if that's what it means to maintain your honor. And of course, it is very much part of Islamist rhetoric to say that Americans or Westerners are not willing to do that, and hence they're contemptible and also defeatable. And that, of course, is obviously not true. But what seems very strange about the Islamist discourse, and I was wondering if it's unique in this regard, is it's not merely that you have to be willing to face death for honor, but positively welcoming it is the honorable thing to do.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure this was particularly true of Islam in the past. I sort of scratched my head about this a little bit, but it's certainly true of its current rhetoric that there is a longing for death and a definition of that longing as being the constituent of honor. Is there any other example of that in the past, or is this really something quite unique in the definition of honor?
I don't know of anything that's quite like that. But you're absolutely right. That you see that again and again. We love death. I mean, there's a famous formulation. If I forget, was it Osama or somebody who said, "We love death more than you love life." And what that intended to convey, it seems to me, was, aren't you afraid of me if I regard my own life with that much contempt? I embrace death, and therefore you should be afraid of me. But it is, as you say, a rhetorical device. It's like, and President Bush was much ridiculed for this when he said, "Bring it on." It's the same kind of thing. I'm not afraid of you, and that's what these kinds of things always convey. You can't hurt me. You can't do anything to me. I'm not afraid of death. Bring it on. It's that kind of fighting rhetoric, but it has a particularly unlovely quality, I think, in those examples that you talk about, that love of death sort of thing. It goes together with suicide bombing, which is a way of sort of practical demonstration that they love death, which is, as I say, not very attractive to our side, I think.
I'm Kyle Vandermeulen. I work here at AEI. This was a fascinating talk, and I'm really looking forward to reading your book. I have a lot of questions, but I guess, broadly speaking, how can you reconcile this sort of schizophrenic nature that we can base major foreign policy decisions off of honor, but yet we can't talk about it? And more specifically, what is it that will perpetuate honor in national honor? Mr. O'Sullivan mentioned that in individual honor, he thinks it's on the heart. What is national honor, and what perpetuates it? Is it the democracy that we have built? Is it sort of like the cultural system? And how can we not talk about it?
I think it comes from the fact that we aren't, in the days when national honor was strong and was easily spoken of, we regarded ourselves and those who and believed in national honor regarded themselves as the bearers of civilization. And that not only was our honor good for us, it was good for everyone, because we had something that the rest of the world needed to get from us. And it's that self-confidence, I think, that's been taken away from us by the political left over the last 70 or 80 years, by, in particular, the stressing of the imperial and racist adventures of our country and of other countries who've had such adventures, and the emphasis on the victimhood of those who supposedly have been damaged and harmed by it. It is. I don't think we can overestimate the importance of that loss of self-confidence, and what leads to one of the other things that John mentioned is this multiculturalism, this belief that all cultures are equally worthy of respect, and our own, we're just humble people, and we're not going to threaten anyone because your culture is just as good as mine. It's that which has produced what we're talking about here.
Jim, hi, I'm Peter Wallison at AEI. I want to just talk a little bit about or have you talk a little bit about your definition of honor, because as I recall, you said it is being respected by others whom you respect, or something to that effect.
Yeah, that's
now,
good.
I'm going to use a phrase here that sounds a little sociological, and that is, it sounds to me as though it's somewhat outer directed. That is to say,
it's very outer directed. Yeah.
This honor would come from the opinions of others rather than coming from inside. Can you reconcile those two for me? Maybe I don't understand the concept entirely.
Yeah, I stress again the primitive nature and the bits of honor that remain primitive, and that's one of them. I think it always is other directed. It always has this public element which differentiates it from morality. We can't decide ourselves whether we will be honored or not. Only other people can decide that, and therefore it's necessarily other directed. But the Western tradition of honor, unlike other traditions, has spent hundreds of years persuading us, and I go through this in the book, persuading us that the inner and the outer ought to coincide, and that there's nothing worse than the hypocrisy of those who pretend to that kind of outward respect but inwardly are undeserving of it. And that's what you see again and again in Western literature as opposed to other literatures that celebrate heroes. The Western hero is the hero whose inner qualities and whose reputation are made to coincide. And if they don't, he's not a hero anymore. It's a sort of tragic element in Western culture that you don't find elsewhere. And so it still is what it is in those primitive honor cultures. It still is your reputation. But one of the differences with our culture is that the reputation also needs to correspond with the inner life.
Alex Pollock of AEI. Jim, among all of the causes for the decline of honor, John in his comments added the rise and the flourishing of the regulatory state.
Yes.
Do you agree with that addition? And where in the list of the weakeners of honor would that be in your view?
I don't disagree with it, but I think it's a question of chicken and egg. Which came first, the regulatory state or the collapse of honor? And I think it was probably the other way around. I don't know whether John insists on the priority of the regulatory state, but I would say that the regulatory state comes in to fill a vacuum when honor is already on its way downhill for other reasons. But it certainly doesn't help, and it is part of what makes it obsolete in our time.
Could I just
to say. I mean, I don't entirely agree with that, as a matter of fact, partly because I think what you see, and this is the period really from about 1900, let us say, to 1945, and maybe even later, what you see is the continuation of social patterns of behavior that clearly are inspired by traditional Western notions of honor. With the advance of the regulatory state, very often people like, Major Attlee, I think a conspicuously honorable person in those terms, being among those who are advancing the regulatory state in ways which then undermine the virtues of which they are ornaments.
Yes, I agree.
So I mean, I think it probably works both ways. I mean, each reinforces the other. But having said that, I do think that probably the advance of regulation came first. And Christy Davis, on whom I rely a certain amount for this, argues that once regulation becomes a major element in criminology, particularly, then categories of guilt and innocence and responsibility cease to matter so much as bureaucratic categories, and people are not sentenced in terms of did they behave with particular viciousness, but does their behavior conform to certain abstract bureaucratic categories, some of which will obtain, will deserve, well, not deserve exactly, but will receive heavier punishments than others.
Let me add a brief word here, because I think it's important to understand we're not talking about EPA or the Federal Communications Commission, but the rise of administrative government, including the criminal law, and essentially the delegation from private society to formal apparatuses, the jobs of determining guilt and innocence, justice, and I would say importantly, the application of violence. So that individuals have long since ceased to believe that the application of violence is anything that they do or is close to them. It is organized. It's professional. And in recent decades, we see this at the international level. You have to go to the Security Council. You have to get a resolution before violence can be applied in relations between states. And when we made our case there, it was a very legalistic case. If Secretary Powell had said, our honor has been besmirched and we are going to reclaim it, the other members of the Security Council wouldn't have known what to think of it. And so I think that this growth of the division of labor and the specialization in determinations and especially the application of violence, it seems to me to have been an important cause of the decline of the idea of violence, and something that if you were to revive it in a postmodern form, so to speak, you would have to contend with.
Yes, I agree with that. But again, I'd say the two proceed pari passu. It's an example, another example of what Sir Henry Maine called the transition from status to contract. It's the way Western civilization has been moving for hundreds of years, really. But particularly, the pace is gathered.
But you're not against all of that. You're not against the criminal law.
No, I'm not against all of that. But I think it's. I think it ought to be possible to arrive at some balance as the Victorians did. I mean, I'd be sorry to think otherwise anyway. Although I can see the argument that it's sort of an inevitable quasi-Marxist process of, the march of history can't be turned backwards. Walton. Yes, yes.
This is related to a question Hillel asked. I'm Walter Burns of AEI. The question of the problem of these Islamicists who kill themselves because they love to die. It seems to me one has to raise the question why they love to die. I raise this question because before coming here I reread Tocqueville's chapter on honor, and there's some tension between honor and the benefit that one might derive. These people who love to die may love to die because they're promised 30 virgins, Now, in the first place, I wonder if there are enough virgins to go around for all these people who are doing all the killing. But still, there's a benefit to it. And it seems to me there's a question as to one can regard an act as honorable if there's this kind of benefit.
I'm afraid I have to say I don't believe that they do love death. I don't believe that they really think they're going to have 30 or 72 or any number of virgins afterwards. I think it's, well, some of them may. I don't think it's impossible that some of them believe that. But I think to a large extent the rhetoric of being in love with death is just that. It's a way of saying, look at me, how terrifying I am, because I spit in the face of death, as some of those boys' comics of our youth used to put it. It's that kind of defiance rather than anything they actually believe, or most of them, I would think.
So I think there is a tension between personal benefit and being honored for it.
Yes, I think there could be, but I think generally in honor cultures, what's valued most is the deed. Does he do it or doesn't he do it? Whether he thought he was going to get 72 virgins or whether he thought he was going to get something else out of it. The important thing is, I mean, somebody, for instance, also on the New Republic website, Lee Siegel was saying, well, these guys weren't really heroes because they didn't have any choice but to fight, but they were going to die anyway. So, it wasn't, I mean, he was kind of downplaying the heroism for that. I mean, who cares? It doesn't matter. They did the honorable thing. Whatever mixed motivations they may have. That's another element of the therapeutic culture that I was talking about. We think what matters is whether the motivation was right. To the honor culture traditionally, it's whether you do the deed or whether you don't.
Gertrude Himmelfarb, B. Crystal.
Yes, both you, Jim, and John use the term multiculturalism,
Yeah.
and you both use the word critically, I think. But isn't there a kind of multiculturalism or relativism in your own definition of honor? That is, isn't Islamic honor, or for that matter Nazi honor, as honorable as our honor? Well, I had a feeling that John tried to mitigate this notion of honor by introducing the idea of softer virtues compensating for the more vigorous virtues. But would you, Jim, want to qualify that term for that reason? I mean, how relativistic are you prepared to be in connection with this concept of honor?
Well, let me say, I think it's not me who's relativistic. I think its honor is relativistic by its very nature, because, as I say, it's about an honor group, and within that group, an action is honorable. If I stand outside the group, it doesn't mean the Nazis or the whoever don't care whether I think they're honorable or not. All they care is whether they're the people in their own group. At the same time, I think it is true to say there is a kind of overlap, and it comes up in respect to the Confederate flag, which I discuss briefly in my book. I think it's possible to say, to respect the honor of someone you profoundly disagree with, because there is a kind of overlap, a kind of common language that honorable people in all cultures will be able to speak. And among those is the recognition that even people who are very bad people in lots of ways can behave in this very limited respect honorably. And for that reason, I don't see a problem with honoring the Confederate flag, not because it was the flag of slave owners, but because it was the flag of honorable men who happened to be, among other things, slave owners.
Can I just come in on this? Sorry, thanks. Yes, first of all, I think that honor is does emerge from particular cultures, although it is interesting that when it emerges first, there's a very strong family resemblance between all these different sorts of warrior honor virtues. Secondly, it can be, as I mentioned, I think courage, for example, which is always a component of honor, can be admired across cultures. My favorite example is the case of Smith's Last Patrol, in which this group of British South African police went out in the Matabele War, were all slaughtered as they were, and their final moments, they ran out of bullets, so they drew their swords, sang "God Save the King" or Queen, I can't remember, and then ran out and were all slaughtered. Now, how do we know this? Well, we know it because the Matabele at the end of the war took the British to the graves where they'd been buried with full Matabele military honours. So this was a recognition across cultures of courage. Now, where I think you did in fact diagnose me rightly, I do think that Western concepts of honor, the Western traditions of honor, attempting to incorporate within them the softer virtues to, so to speak, restrain and soften the vigorous virtues, I do think that they broaden the appeal, cultural appeal of Western traditions of honor, so that the honor group is, I don't say it's potentially the entire human race, but it certainly proved to be a very large chunk of the human race circa 1900. And therefore, although I think there's an element of obviously cultural relativism in this, it's one which in our traditions I think is extremely limited and in principle at least capable of being overcome entirely.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is time to conclude. I said at the beginning that this was an astonishingly original piece of work. It has revived many old ideas, and it has transformed them. In my view, the greatest contribution of what Jim Bowman has done, beyond the intrinsic interest of the work itself, is, as we've seen, I think, the beginning of in this conversation this afternoon, to give us a new vocabulary, a new way of thinking about and talking about some matters that were familiar but in part confused. And I think that this contribution is going to prove to be very deep indeed. John O'Sullivan, thank you very much for coming and for your contributions. Most of all, I'd like to thank and congratulate and ask us all to give a warm round of applause to James Bowman.
James Bowman is a movie critic for the